Aloha, this is Ron Crouch of Aloha Dharma, and today I want to describe the progress of insight, which is a really important central concept in insight meditation that essentially describes the progress of a meditator from the very first insights that they have in their meditation to all the way to enlightenment. So all of the things that happen when they first sit and all the things in between. So as you can imagine, this progress of insight is key to really making progress yourself in insight. Knowing the territory is very important. It is not the territory itself, but it's very important to know. It's useful to know. And in the same way that you wouldn't try to go on a road trip across the country without having a road map, or at least a GPS or something else to guide you, you wouldn't want to get on the path to enlightenment without at least knowing what to expect, what happens, what are the landmarks, what are the signposts that tell you that you're making progress, that you're on your way, that you're doing it right, and how can you find out if you're just getting stuck? And that's what the progress of insight is all about. Now, the progress of insight is made up of 16 stages called jnanas in Pali, which translate as insight knowledges. And they're similar to the jhanas, which are the concentration states that are talked about a lot in the suttas. In fact, there's a strong relationship between the insight knowledges and the jhanas that is complex and I think in some cases kind of controversial and poorly understood. However, there is a relationship between the concentration states and the insight knowledge states. So if you're familiar at all with the jhanas, then the insight stages, or jnanas, should make intuitive sense to you. Because what they are is a set of experiences that a person has. Each one has certain characteristics, certain qualities that make it what it is, and they appear in a specific order. So after you've had the first one, the second one comes, then the third, and so on. And they're pretty universal. Now, before I get into what the insight stages are and what the progress of insight is, I want to take a minute to talk about what we mean by the word path in meditation. This is one of those words that has a whole lot of meanings, and for the most part it is more confusing than it is helpful. So I want to take a moment to unpack that a little bit and make it clear what it is that I'm talking about when I say path in this teaching. So the path is used, as far as I can tell, outside of Buddhism or sometimes outside of the insight traditions in Buddhism. The path is used in very vague ways. That it's thought of as kind of a grand abstract thing, something metaphysical, something that's kind of aspirational rather than real. It's very ill-defined and confusing, and many people who talk about being on the path kind of have this sense to them of, the best that I can sort of make of it is that it's a sense of confused wonder. They know something profound is going on, but they have no clear idea of what it really is. And so a lot of people will say things that are essentially nonsense, like the path is the goal, or that the journey is the destination, those kinds of glib Hallmark card type sayings. A lot of that it just lends itself to further confusion and is not helpful, I think, to meditators who are sincere about wanting to become enlightened. So it's really a terrible shame, too, because the Buddha and other great mystics really put a tremendous amount of work into laying out as clearly as possible and as practical as possible what the actual path is. They drew essentially a roadmap for people of how to get from a normal, conditioned existence where one is stressed out and suffering a lot to one where a person is liberated and has insight into causes and conditions and can no longer be bound to the wheel of suffering. So they gave a very clear set of instructions on what to do, and then a very clear roadmap from what happens when a person actually does what they ask them to do. So there are multiple roadmaps, and I'm not going to get into what all of them are. They all seem to have some core threads in common, and I think that generally all of these different maps are pointing in the same direction. The one map that I'm going to talk about today is, as I said before, the insight knowledges, because it's the map that I'm personally most familiar with. It's the one that I'm most comfortable teaching, and it's not to imply that the other maps are somehow wrong or not valuable. It's just simply that I'm not qualified to teach them. The word path also has, as far as I can tell, 3 distinct meanings in the way it's used in the insight tradition, insight meditation community. The first meaning is people will sometimes talk about the path as being the behaviors and views or attitudes that one adopts to help one line up with the goal of becoming enlightened. And so essentially, when people say path in this sense, what they're talking about is, what am I doing with my life to help me to become enlightened? I think this is not a very helpful use of the word path. It is confusing, and it lends itself to a lot of things that are fairly vague, and it ends up getting mixed in with other uses of the word. A second way that we use the word path is when we talk about a path moment. A path moment is what happens when we get to the end of our insight stages. And it is a moment where the mind essentially falls onto or alights onto nirvana. And it's a moment of cessation. We call it a path moment because that's traditionally what it's been called. Phala and Magga, path and fruit. And I'll get into what it means and what it's like a little bit later. And then finally, the third way that we use the word path is to describe, as I was saying earlier, the 16 stages or insight stages that lead one from conditioned existence to enlightenment. So that, to me, is the most useful way to use the word path. It just makes intuitive sense, because in that respect, what we're talking about it is really like a path. It's a description of what happens to a person as they make progress, and it describes all of the signposts and markers and landmarks that one encounters along the way. It's very much like a path. So rather than have sort of a vague idea or a vague notion of the path as some abstract metaphysical thing or something that isn't actually real, in Buddhism and in insight meditation, the path is very real, and it's not vague at all. There are very clear, distinct stages that everyone goes through. So let me talk a little bit about what those stages are. I divide up the the 16 stages into 5 overall segments. The physiocognitive segment, the arising and passing, the dark night, equanimity, and cessation. So those to me are the 5 big chunks of the path that the person passes through as they're making their way to enlightenment. Physiocognitive, arising and passing, dark night, equanimity, and cessation. Now some of those are my terms. Physiocognitive stage is a term that I created. Dark night is a Christian mystic term. I think it was coined by St. John of the Cross. It was first used for this portion of the path by Kenneth Folk and was written about extensively by Daniel Ingram, and is talked about a lot on the Dharma Overground Forum and the Kenneth Folk Dharma Forum. Equanimity and cessation are part and parcel of the language of the insight stages. The insight stages, as I said before, were laid out by Mahasi Sayadaw in his manual called The Progress of Insight. He did not make these stages up, or he didn't discover these stages. They were laid out even prior to that in the Visuddhimagga and the Vitumanaga. I cannot say that one. The path to freedom. The Visuddhimagga is the path to purification, path of purification. So let me begin by describing some of the stages. The first one, the physiocognitive stage, is made up of 3 sub-stages or states. The 3 are mind and body, cause and effect, and 3 characteristics. When a person first sits, they start to do the insight meditation technique correctly, then they begin to transform their experience and they slip into the very first insight stage, which is mind and body. Mind and body is where the person distinguishes between mental and physical phenomena. It really is just that simple. You begin to see that there's a difference between thinking, remembering, fantasizing, planning, list making, and pressure, heat, hearing, tasting, smelling. All of those things all have a very different phenomenological flavor. And you are really able to see that clearly in this first stage. Now, that may not sound like much of a big deal, and sometimes it's a stage that can pretty easily be missed. But it's absolutely necessary for all the things that happen after this stage. You really need to get that clear, that mind and body are different phenomena, and that they're happening kind of in ways that are distinct from one another. Another thing that happens at this stage is that the meditator makes a very subtle, sometimes hard to detect shift from being those things, so being itching, being pressure, being thinking, to watching those things. So watching memory, watching hearing, just watching those things as they happen. So it's the first little tiny step back and away from experience that allows you to see it clearly without getting too involved or too engrossed in it. The second is cause and effect. That's the second stage, or the second sub-stage of the physiocognitive stage. And cause and effect is essentially when the person recognizes that there is mind phenomena and body phenomena arising in awareness, and that they're connected, that they interact with one another. So that's where you're sitting there, you're in meditation, and you hear a siren in the distance. And then you have immediately a memory of a time when you were injured. And then you have fear climb up your spine. And then you have pain in that part of your body where you were injured. So in that moment, as you're sitting there meditating, you're clearly seeing the connection between hearing, thinking, feeling, emotions. All those things are interconnected in that moment, and you're seeing them. You're seeing each one as distinct phenomena that are influencing the other. They're conditioning each other. The final substage of the physiocognitive stage, this first chunk of the path, is 3 characteristics. And 3 characteristics is really, it can be a very difficult time for a meditator when they're in 3 characteristics, because it feels as if the mind is a little bit out of control and that painful things are happening. During 3 characteristics, you begin to notice that all kinds of sort of unpleasant things you're becoming aware of all these unpleasant things that have been happening sort of in the background of awareness. Aches, itches, difficult body sensations, along with unpleasant thoughts, emotions that are coming up in that moment. And one of the things that's really difficult about it is that none of it seems to be in your control. It's all just happening on its own, and it's really happening fast. One person that I talked to, who's a student of mine, described this stage as being a little bit like a clown car, just watching the mind sort of whiz around like a clown car, throwing out clowns that were ridiculous. So a thought of an old memory of being embarrassed in high school, followed by an itch on the foot, followed by a sound that distracts you, followed by a fantasy of what to do this coming weekend, followed by a song that won't get out of your head. And all of it seems to be just happening to you, and none of it seems to be you. But you have no control over it. So it's all kind of got this flavor of suffering to it. It's all clearly not you because you're watching it all happen. And it's all happening quickly, swiftly. Things are changing all the time. And what's going on is that you're getting insight into the 3 characteristics, into suffering, impermanence, and non-self. And it's really sort of a cursory understanding, but it is an important understanding, and it will become deeper the further you go into the path. So the physiocognitive stage is this first chunk of the path made up of these 3 substages: mind and body, cause and effect, and 3 characteristics. And you can understand why I would give it the name physiocognitive, because it has a lot to do with the mental and physical experiences that a person has, and connecting those 2 together and getting a deeper understanding of them. The next stage on the path has just 1 stage to it. It doesn't have any sub-stages. And it's called the knowledge of arising and passing away. The knowledge of arising and passing away is a crucial moment in the life of a meditator. Somebody who experiences the A&P, the arising and passing, really crosses what I think Daniel Ingram called an event horizon. They begin to really get into territory that is now could really be called mystical territory. Things change a lot after you get into the A&P. And essentially what the A&P is it's really a deep look at the insight knowledge of impermanence. Because what happens in the A&P is that everything is flickering, pulsing, strobing in and out of existence very quickly. Now, sometimes that's not even what's at the forefront of your experience or your mind. For some people, what happens is that they feel a bit of a vibration, but for the most part, what they really experience are things like tingles, pleasant emotions like joy. Sometimes people will experience light, and sometimes the lights are very faint, and they seem to be happening kind of in the background, behind a person. or sometimes they're right in front of you and they're very, very bright. There's a whole range of experiences that make up the A&P, but one thing that is clear about the A&P is that you have left ordinary meditation and you are now in the midst of something mystical happening. And the reason that you can say that with some certainty is that you're beginning to experience things that have zero to do with the environment. They're all created by the meditation process itself. So you're beginning to feel these pleasant sensations, these rapturous body sensations, these emotions that are wonderful, sometimes a bit thrilling, sometimes a little too much, can even be a little scary, are kind of going through you. And it is a fantastic experience. At this point, you know that there's something to meditation, that it goes far beyond what the first three stages led you to believe. The first three stages were fairly mundane. They taught you a little bit about how your mind and body interact to create suffering, and they showed you a little bit about maybe some of your triggers for stress and some of the patterns that you engage in that might be causing you difficulty. But this is a whole different animal. When you get to the A&P, you're now beginning to experience things that mystics talk about, and you're beginning to understand them in ways that you never really could before. Now, the A&P is, as I said before, really, from my perspective, it's an insight into the truth of impermanence, into the characteristic of impermanence. You are getting a deeper look at the fundamental going in and out of all phenomena. Everything is arising into being and passing away out of being each and every instant. And you're finally getting a really good look at that process. And it's thrilling. The mind feels somewhat liberated by it. So for most people, the arising and passing is a joyous experience. You're very happy that you've gone through it. And as you're making your way through it, you're beginning to get insight into what is meant by impermanence. That it's not simply just this understanding of how things change and decay and grow old and die, but rather it's this truth about how reality is presenting itself on a microcosm level. It's a very fine-grained, distinct understanding that each and every sensation that's occurring in this instant, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or a physical sensation, is arising into existence very rapidly and falling out of existence just as rapidly. And you're seeing that happen in real time, and it's a wonderful thing. Next, you move into the dark night. Now, the dark night is a tough stage, just as the name would suggest. And for some people, the dark night is really not that bad. It's like having having a cold. You just do what you can. You get through it, and you learn a few things, and you come out the other side, and you're better. For some people, it can be pretty debilitating, especially if they don't know that they're in the dark night. Then they can end up trying to solve a problem that's created by the meditation by doing things in their life that have nothing to do with the problem. So, for example, it's not unusual for people to be meditating, and they end up in the dark night, and then they are desperately looking for what's causing them to be so miserable, so they quit their job. Or they make some poor decisions in relationships or something like that. It's really important, I think, that people know what the map is, what the insight stages are, so that especially when they get into the dark night, they know what to expect and they can behave skillfully. So let me describe what the sub-stages of the dark night are. There's disillusion, fear, misery, disgust, desire for deliverance, and reobservation. The first one is disillusion. otherwise known as the knowledge of dissolution. And dissolution is essentially the understanding, the insight knowledge of things falling away, of things dissolving, disappearing. And if you think about the arising and passing as the mind really seeing things both arising and passing away in existence, disillusion is that moment where the mind begins to follow things as they are disappearing. It focuses on the disappearance of things. This happens all by itself. It doesn't need any effort on your part. If you're doing the technique correctly, your mind will automatically sync up with the dissolution of phenomena and pay attention to that. What it feels like to the individual as you are going through this stage is that things feel as if they have suddenly slowed down quite a bit. So you're in the arising and passing, and things are exciting. There may be lights, raptures, you feel a lot of joy, and there's this feeling of phenomena quickly arising and passing out of existence. And then, all of a sudden, you come out of the arising and passing, and things are suddenly very slowed down. Phenomena are still arising and passing fairly quickly, but you have a real hard time keeping up with all that stuff because you feel like you've slowed down a lot. Seems like all you can do is pay attention to things after they've already disappeared, and that's exactly the case. People will feel sometimes a sinking sensation when they're getting into dissolution. Sometimes they will feel a cool sensation on the skin. And they will often report that they have difficulty sort of paying attention to things or keeping up with things. The next insight stage is the knowledge of fear. And this is exactly what it sounds like. The knowledge of fear is a sudden, panicky feeling, an alarm, an anxiety will creep into the body all of a sudden. It has a very physical quality to it. And it's not unusual that people will think that they've had some sort of anxiety attack or even a full-on panic attack because of getting into this knowledge of fear. One way to think about this is that when the mind has been focusing on the dissolution of phenomena and the endings of phenomena, there's a point where the mind syncs up with that enough to get the realization that all things dissolve, all things end, all things come to a final ending, including the self. And this is terrifying. This is true existential fear. And it has a very prominent kind of flavor to it. When it happens in meditation, it's kind of unmistakable. People will describe that suddenly they were very alarmed and they didn't know why, and there didn't seem to be a reason for it. It just happened out of the blue. The third stage within the dark night is the insight knowledge of misery. This can be thought of as kind of almost a grieving process after fear. And what misery is it's essentially what it sounds like. It just feels like you're miserable. It's actually a pretty accurate name for what the stage is. At the time, when I was going through it, it felt to me almost as if I had the flu. It had sort of this quality to it that was both physical and mental. And it just felt like everything was just dreadful. It was just terrible. And I literally did think that I was getting sick. I wasn't sure what was going on. I knew that I was heading into this insight stage, but I didn't understand what it was actually like. I thought that misery would be something sort of more like I would have miserable thoughts or something. But instead, it's not like that at all. It's more of an actual full body, full mind experience where you literally feel misery. And it's somewhat difficult to describe. It's not quite like a full-on depression, but it's definitely lower than your baseline mood for most people. Following on the knowledge of misery is disgust. Disgust is, for many, a very brief insight knowledge. However, it's I think, a very important one. Because disgust is it's the mind saying that it wants liberation. It really wants liberation. It's looking at the phenomena of the world and seeing that nothing that comes into awareness is inherently satisfying. Nothing at all. So at first, you saw the endings of all phenomena. You were fearful about it. You felt misery and some grief about the loss of all phenomena, including the self. And then finally, there is disgust. And when disgust happens, what happens is that things that would normally be pleasing or pleasant, things that normally you would look to escape from some kind of suffering or boredom, suddenly become unpleasant and literally very disgusting. Things like food and just the whole act of eating can seem kind of disgusting. Sex will seem disgusting. The body itself can just feel disgusting. I remember very distinctly having a feeling like my skin was very dirty at this time. Not in an obsessive compulsive sense, but literally like just it was just gross feeling. I also had the sense of not enjoying entertainment that normally I would have liked, that would have distracted me and made me feel happy. During that insight stage, even that seemed rather pointless and unsatisfying. And it is. Inherently, it is unsatisfying because it cannot bring lasting happiness. And all things in that stage you find don't bring lasting happiness. And the mind is finally beginning to really absorb that truth. So even a bowl of ice cream, even something as lovely as that, doesn't seem to do it for you anymore. And that's the insight knowledge of disgust. After disgust comes desire for deliverance. And desire for deliverance is a stage where the meditator just really wants it all to be over now. By this point, you're ready for liberation. You're ready for the path to be done. And some people, they just wish that the path had never started at this point because it's been so negative for some time now. And especially when you compare it to the arising and passing. When you compare this experience to the arising and passing, it can feel really awful. What am I doing wrong? How did it get this bad? And sometimes meditators might not understand that they've actually made progress. During the desire for deliverance stage, what's happening is the mind is really just wanting things to wrap up. It really wants to move into the next stages and get liberation and insight. And there's this strong desire for that to happen. And it can be a very pitiful stage. I remember when it happened to me, I actually whined a little bit while I was meditating. I made little whimpering noises. It's embarrassing to say that now, but it's actually true. And other people have reported that it happened to them as well. And when I reported it to my teacher, he said, "Yep, that sure happens." So during this stage, it can be just this very pitiful feeling of wanting it to be over and feeling kind of sorry for yourself. The next insight stage in the dark night is the last stage of the dark night, and it's called reobservation. Reobservation is My teacher once described it as the king daddy of the dukkha jnanas, of the knowledges of suffering. It's a beast, and it can be really rough for people. And it's unfortunate that it has such a nerdy name like reobservation when it's such a rough stage. People aren't really ready for how difficult it can be. So it's almost as if you have this one last steep hill to climb before you get out of the dark night, and it's reobservation, and it's the steepest hill of them all yet. And essentially what reobservation is it's all of the previous dark night stages all wrapped up together. So all of the things that made the previous dark night stages difficult all happen at nearly the same time. So they all kind of happen on top of each other. In that stage, it's not unusual for a meditator to sit and to feel slowed down, like they can't keep up, to feel panic and flu-like symptoms and sense of disgust, and then this pitiful whining, and then more disgust and more fear, and then the sense that they can't keep up with it all. And it can be a very difficult stage, and it can go on for some time if you resist it strongly. Reobservation is really sort of the final test when you can approach reobservation with a sense of sort of this, what I would call stubborn equanimity, in the sense that you are going to do this, and you are going to succeed, and you are going to approach liberation, but you're going to do it by accepting everything that happens. So you're not resisting, you're not fighting it, you're simply observing it with as much calm and clarity and acceptance as you can. That's really the key to getting through reobservation, and it's really the key to getting through all of the dark night stages. The next stage, after reobservation and after the dark night, is equanimity. Equanimity is a really crucial stage, and I could probably devote a whole half an hour or so just to talking about that, but I'll try to keep it as short as I can. Equanimity is typically divided up into two stages: lower equanimity and higher equanimity. That's not the case in the suttas or in many of the commentaries. However, many people who are familiar with this territory and have really moved through equanimity many times describe it in those terms. And it makes sense because there do seem to be two qualitatively distinct stages within equanimity. The first one, lower equanimity, is this feeling that things have shifted somewhat in reobservation. So in that stage, what's happening is you're sitting in reobservation. Phenomena that are arising in awareness each and every moment are fairly negative. And all of a sudden, it feels as if you have taken a step back from them. And now, those phenomena really aren't happening to you anymore. They're just happening. And at the time that it happened to me, I once described it as, it felt like I was tumbling around in a clothes dryer full of negative mind states, and then all of a sudden I was watching it from outside the dryer. And it's kind of a goofy example, but it pretty accurately describes what the switch was like. It was very sudden, and yet it was pretty subtle. All of a sudden, I wasn't in the midst of it, but it was all still happening. And it can actually be easy to miss because you're still noting and being mindful of all of the same things. Irritation, disgust, fear, misery, all those things are still coming up. You're still noting them, but suddenly you're not really suffering from them anymore. They're just there. And as time goes on, those negative qualities seem to sort of fade out. and more neutral qualities seem to come to the fore. And a lot of people will describe lower equanimity as they shift out of the dark night and into lower equanimity. They describe that as just sitting. And that's what it feels like. It's a profound return to the ordinary. All of a sudden, nothing's going on. The meditation just feels like perfectly normal, except there's this powerful calm and ease to it that you didn't have before. It almost seems like the meditation has become really easy. Everything is just happening. All these ordinary phenomena are happening, and you're just watching it all happen with a lot of calm and clarity. As time moves on, the phenomena that are presenting themselves, so whether they're mental phenomena, physical phenomena, emotional things, whatever's coming up, these things begin to have a vibratory quality to them. And this is your signal that you're moving into higher equanimity. As things develop a vibratory quality, at first you begin to have the sense that things are vibrating in a very fine way, very fine. It's almost like everything has a small, distinct hum to it that is almost hard to pick up. But as you keep going and your meditation deepens, the humming quality or the vibratory quality becomes more distinct. And what's interesting is that everything begins to have this vibratory quality to it. So it doesn't matter if it's a thought, if it's a physical sensation, if it's something you heard. Whatever's happening in that moment seems to be vibrating in this very fine way. At first, this is just interesting. It's just an interesting thing that's going on, and you're watching it. But as time goes on, it seems as if your mind begins to speed up. Your clarity and mindfulness and concentration and investigation, all of these things that sort of constitute the meditation, all of those qualities begin to sort of increase in magnitude. They begin to take on a little more power. And you'll find that if you're doing noting meditation, that it's around this time that the noting itself begins to become kind of clunky. It seems to be getting in the way of actually noticing. And a lot of people will report that they drop noting at this point because it just seems like noting at this point slows you down. And you're noticing so many things. You're really seeing clearly everything that's happening. So the mind speeds up, the process begins to become more clear, and all objects begin to have this vibratory quality to them. Then, what happens is, all of the objects that have a vibratory quality to them, so everything, begins to sync up. Everything begins to sync up. So all these separate vibratory qualities that make up your experience in that moment, so everything that's happening in your field of awareness in that moment, all of that stuff that's vibrating, it's all vibrating in its own rate, it's all vibrating kind of differently, and then it all starts to sync together. And it's all vibrating in the same sort of frequency, if you will. When this happens, the whole field of awareness becomes sort of your object of meditation at that point. Everything taken together is vibrating, and it's the vibratory nature of all of it that becomes your focus of attention. That becomes your object of meditation. When that happens, concentration increases quite a bit, because you're no longer focusing on different objects. You're focusing on one object and you're keeping the mind on it. And that object is the vibratory nature of the whole field of awareness. When that happens, the meditation becomes much more profound. It's almost as if the whole thing just really jumps in power quite a bit. And it has more of the mystical quality to it that A and P had. It's at this point that the meditator becomes fascinated by the gaps in the vibration. And it's as if there's something in those, something in the gaps that's in the vibrations that becomes compelling. There's something about it that's very, very interesting. And the mind is naturally drawn to it. At this point, you do not have to do anything. In fact, the more you do, the more you slow things down. And all the meditator needs to do at this point is really just get out of the way and allow the process to happen. So you're just watching as the mind sort of naturally tunes into the vibratory quality and the gaps in the vibrations, those moments in the vibration where there's nothing. And then you move to the next stage, cessation. Cessation begins with something called insight leading to emergence. And this is essentially where you become fascinated with those gaps in meditation, and it's as if the mind is inclining toward nirvana. That's one way it's described in the commentary. So the mind is inclining toward nirvana. It seems to want to investigate what's in those gaps. And then the next stage is adaptation. At this point, everything that I'm going to describe next happens within a few moments. And it happens very, very quickly in terms of relative time. So there's insight leading to emergence, adaptation, then maturity, path, and fruit. So adaptation is the moment when the mind has fully developed all of the insight and knowledge that it needs to let go completely and fall into nirvana. So it's almost as if it now has realized the truth of suffering, impermanence, and non-self. It's seen it enough now that it has fully adapted to it and it's ready to let go. The next stage is maturity. And maturity can be thought of as the moment when you first notice a cessation beginning. It's the moment when the mind first falls into nirvana, or as Mahasi Sayadaw put it, the mind begins to alight upon nirvana. It's a very distinct moment. Many people miss it because it happens so quickly. But for some people, it is a very clear moment. And I remember it, the first one very, very clearly. It felt as if a big eyelid was blinking. That's exactly what it felt like. Or maybe a shade being drawn from the top of my field of awareness to the bottom. So there's this sense that all of a sudden there is this shift in awareness, and there's something that's beginning to happen that is different. And that is maturity. Path and fruit are the next two stages, and that is the moment when the cessation happens. It's the moment when the mind falls completely into nirvana. And fruit is the moment of experiencing nirvana directly after path. So essentially this whole thing, the cessation moment, can be summed up in this way. You're sitting there in equanimity. All of reality is vibrating in front of you, and it's brilliant, it's fascinating, it's so interesting. You are getting out of the way and just watching what happens, and the mind naturally inclines towards the gaps in the vibrations that it's experiencing. And suddenly, it's as if it winks out of existence. The mind, the body, everything. Suddenly, everything goes. When you come back from your cessation, then you have reached the first stage of enlightenment. And you can tell that this happens because the first thing that occurs when you come back from your cessation is you feel bliss. You feel a tremendous amount of bliss. My teacher described it as a bliss wave. I think that's a pretty good description because it kind of comes on in a way that's a little bit slow at first and then it just builds. And it's a experience of relief. I literally felt as if I had taken off a real heavy backpack that I didn't even know I had on. It really felt like I had lightened my load. And there's a sense that something has changed, but it's really hard to pin down what it is. There's something about the way you're experiencing life that's different than it was just a moment ago, but you can't quite say what it is. It's hard to pin down. As time goes on, life after path begins to reveal more about the changes that have occurred to you. But there's no doubt in your mind after path that you're not the same anymore. And that the meditation is no longer the same anymore. Now, the reason that I describe all of this is to help people to know that these things are real. And there's no reason why somebody can't do them. If you simply know what the roadmap is from getting from either your first sit and starting the technique and learning how to do it, then if you know what comes next and you know what to do, there's no reason why you can't make your way through all of these insight stages, all the way up to your own cessation, and see for yourself that these things are real and that liberation is possible. Knowing these states and stages is to know what the path is. And to directly experience them is to gain insight into the three characteristics. And to gain insight into the three characteristics is liberation. I hope that everybody who listens to this is able to follow the path to its end and experience liberation for themselves. Mahalo.